The fire is still a whisper this morning, coaxed out of embers by hands that know better than to hope for haste. Dawn seeps in through gaps in the shutters and across a thatched roof cottage in 13th century Lincolnshire. A woman named Edgith is poking the hearth with a stick that used to be part of a fence post, or possibly someone's broom handle in its former life. The rooster gave up trying to impress anyone an hour ago, and the village pigs have decided to stage a parade beside the cottage door, snorting in rhythm like medieval tuba players. But this clamour doesn't much concern Edgith, who is busy transforming oily oats and resigned kale into something technically classified as breakfast. In the medieval kitchen, if you could call it that, it's not the ingredients that are impressive, but the sheer willpower required to cook them. There's no intriguing spice rack or spice grinder, unless you count a rolling pin and an aggressive attitude. Salt is treasured like a royal dowry, and pepper is nearly worth its weight in goats. The hearth is the heart of it all. Not a stove, mind you. Just an open fire in the middle of the room, sometimes stone-lined if you're lucky, or vaguely surrounded by crooked bricks and a healthy respect for not tripping into it. Over this blaze hangs a pot so blackened with soot, it has its own folklore. Whatever goes into that pot becomes pottage, the Middle Ages version of, it'll do. Pottage was a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and sometimes, on days of unusual luck or neighbourly favouritism, a remnant of bacon or a sullen bit of salted fish. Lumpy and loyal, pottage could simmer all day, changing identities with every passing hour, breakfast to lunch, then lunch to something melancholy and grey by supper. Bread, of course, was a staple. But let's not get romantic here. This was not the kind of bread that makes you weep and post about it on social media. No crusty sourdoughs or heirloom grains. You might have barley bread if you're modestly well off, and rye if you've wronged a baker. Sometimes they'd mix flour with mashed beans, old peas, or a bit of sawdust if no one was checking. These loaves were tough, and not in an artisanal way. More in the would make an excellent doorstop kind of way. The truly fancy folks, lords, abbots, and people who owned more than one spoon, had actual ovens. The rest made do with baking directly on hot stones beside the fire, or in covered pans nestled in ash. Either method produced a bread loaf so tragic it could legally apply for monastic status. Utensils were charmingly limited. Forget measuring cups or spatulas. A large wooden spoon was the backbone of any medieval kitchen arsenal, doubled as a stirrer, a tasting spoon, and on occasion, an instrument of swift disagreement. Knives were valuable and often personal items. You brought your own knife to meals, like how you might bring a bottle of wine to a dinner party, only with slightly more gravitas and slightly fewer wine glasses. As for meat, well, it happened, but not often. Hunting was mostly for the elite, the church, or very determined poachers who viewed life insurance as an afterthought. Ordinary folk managed with eggs, if the chickens were in a generous mood, salted herring, or that one suspicious chicken leg saved in a root cellar since Tuesday. But just once in a while, say during a festival, or on a particularly buoyant Saints' Day, there'd be access to something grand. A rabbit, perhaps, or a scrap of mutton so small that its disappearance could be blamed on a particularly aggressive cat. And drinks? Water was a gamble. Ale was safer. Weak ale, often brewed at home, kept the thirst at bay without toppling children off benches. Even toddlers had a sip now and then, because hydration, medieval style, was nothing if not democratic. Still, despite the limitations, there's something undeniably soothing about the rhythm of it all. The crackling fire, the scraping of iron pots. The quiet prayer that the bread doesn't turn green this time. Preparing food in the Middle Ages wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, comforting, predictable as the rising smoke curling up into the rafters. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Shall we keep the fire going a little longer tonight? If you were a peasant waking up in England around the year 1275, congratulations. You've likely just slept on a straw mattress stuffed with something that definitely poked you while you dreamed. Perhaps your first thoughts might be about the weather. Possibly your aching knees. But most urgently, it would be food. And unless you were one of the rare few considered wealthy, meaning you had 2 entire chickens, you weren't waking up to the scent of sizzling bacon and eggs. Instead, your typical medieval morning would greet you with something more medieval. Something like pottage. Pottage. The oatmeal of the Middle Ages. Technically a soup, legally a stew, emotionally the edible equivalent of shrugging. Pottage was both everything and nothing. It was the canvas upon which you painted your culinary hopes. Only those hopes were usually painted in shades of barley, water, and a hopeful turnip. In its humble bubbling, pottage embodied the medieval kitchen spirit, combining whatever ingredients you might find, borrow, or remember digging up last week. You could throw in beans, peas, grain, or cabbage if you were lucky. If someone in the village had recently tripped over a mushroom, voila, a garnish. Now, you might ask, did they have breakfast cereals? Only if you count chewing on leftover bread until it seems slightly less brick-like. Bread, in fact, was the backbone of medieval meals, provided you could get it. From the finest white, manchet to the coarsest bran-stuffed loaves, medieval bread had more layers than a historical novel about a confused monk. But the star of these early meals wasn't what you ate. It was how you cooked it. Welcome to the heart of every medieval home, the hearth. Positioned smack in the middle of the hall, this smoky shrine radiated warmth, soot, and occasional inspiration. Picture a smoky room where the family gathers not just to eat, but to dry out their damp wool tunics and question the decisions that led to someone dropping barley into last night's stew. Lacking ovens, most peasant households embraced open-fire cooking like a very flammable embrace. Cast iron cauldrons hung on tripods or cranes over the fire, slowly churning today's pottage into tomorrow's enhanced leftovers. You didn't so much cook meals as you kept a single meal on life support for weeks at a time. When it came to tools, the average Middle Ages kitchen had exactly as many utensils as you could carry in one hand. Perhaps a wooden spoon, an iron pot, and an optimistic ladle. Knives? Essential, but most folks had just one. And it did everything from slicing turnips to occasionally solving heated debates about cheese distribution. And what about spices? Did these early chefs season to taste? Only if taste consisted of a pinch of salt, i.e. medieval treasure, and maybe a smidge of mustard seed or dill if your garden hadn't been raided by geese. People didn't use spices extravagantly unless they were nobility or owned a camel. Still, medieval cooks were not without invention. Take the mortar and pestle, the king and queen of kitchen gadgets. With these trusty tools, you could pound herbs into submission and pretend you were creating something refined, when in fact, you were just desperately trying to soften parsley. Outside of your humble roof, the village bakehouse might play a crucial culinary role. Since poor households didn't have bread ovens, villagers would take their homemade loaves to be baked communally. Of course, This meant trusting your neighbours not to accidentally walk off with your best barley bun. You might add a secret nick to the dough's surface, a kind of medieval watermark, just to be sure your bread didn't elope. Life in the kitchen wasn't glamorous, but amidst the splattering stews and charcoal perfumes, it was rich in a quiet sort of resilience. Meals weren't merely eaten, they were survived together, one wooden bowl at a time. Children were fed, bread was shared, and not every turnip was lost to mould. As the flames in the hearth danced low and sleepy, and someone muttered about needing more firewood, that perpetual medieval refrain, a sense of comfort settled in. Bland, slightly overboiled comfort, but comfort all the same. And beyond the door, the village stirred. Animals shuffled, bells tolled, and somewhere, an elderly woman was already up to her elbows in leeks. Let's linger there for a moment longer, in the smoky simplicity, where a spoonful of pottage might be reheated again, while the church bell hums softly in the misty morning air. Before we wander further into the midday musings of a peasant's palate, as the sun peeked lazily over the thatched rooftops of a medieval village, casting honey-coloured light through a gentle swirl of wood smoke, our ordinary folk, those rustic culinary adventurers, stirred from their straw-stuffed mattresses. Not with alarm clocks, mind you, but with the plaintive mooing of cows and the indignant honking of geese who considered themselves surprisingly punctual. Breakfast in the Middle Ages rarely involved heaping plates of scrambled eggs and pancakes. No. It was more of a quiet nod to sustenance than a celebratory feast. A bushel of barley bread dunked into last night's pottage, handed off to a bleary-eyed villager who had already stubbed their toe twice on the uneven plank floor. Let's talk about pottage for a moment, a dish whose name sounds like a magic spell cast by a tired cook. It was, more or less, a living stew, like a bubbling cauldron that never quite stopped being lunch or dinner or Wednesday's breakfast. It simmered constantly, changing its contents as the week progressed, evolving like a culinary time traveller. Toss in a parsnip here, a cabbage leaf there, a suspiciously chewy piece of something you swear used to be meat, and you had a meal that grew and changed with each spoonful. Fueling this never-ending dinner potion were bread and ale, staples so fundamental they might as well have been part of the village charter. Bread came in many forms, depending on your status and what you had lying around. For most folks, bread was coarse and dark, dense enough to double as a paperweight, or in an emergency, a weapon. The rich, on the other hand, had lighter, whiter loaves thanks to better flour and the distinct advantage of not having to grind it themselves with a stone that predated Charlemagne. Water wasn't always trusted, and for a good reason. If it didn't make you sick, it was probably just plotting to. So ale was the medieval answer, low in alcohol and high in safety. It was the all-day beverage of choice. Yes, even for breakfast, especially for breakfast. And before you judge, just remember that it was kind of like lightly alcoholic oatmeal in a cup, only bready and less optimistic. Now, let's peer into the cooking area of one such humble home. It was quite democratic in its discomfort. Imagine a central fire pit, more smoke than flame, with a blackened iron pot hanging above it and hopeful herbs strung nearby to dry into something vaguely more usable. Chimneys weren't yet a common feature, so the smoke had to find its way out however it could, often choosing your face as its shortest exit route. Eyes stung, brows smudged in ash. The cooking experience was equal parts endurance test and spiritual growth. Utensils. Forgo your dreams of shiny ladles and ergonomic spatulas. A wooden spoon here, a bent iron fork there if you were lucky, and fingers, glorious, soot-smudged fingers, did most of the heavy lifting. Meat was a sometime thing. If it was available, hurrah. Into the pot it went. If not, well, there were always beans, barley, onions, or something vaguely edible from the garden. Preservation was an art form built on salt, smoke, and sworn oaths. Salting meat practically turned it into a wall tile, and drying fish created edible bookmarks with flavor profiles best described as medievally robust. Spices sounded like magical luxuries, and they were to the working class. Imagine catching a whiff of cinnamon in the midst of boiled turnips. That's not dinner. That's a hallucination. Most seasoned their food with what was at hand: leeks, garlic, mustard seeds, and deeply rooted resentment for those who could afford pepper. Despite all this, there was a warmth, a gentleness to the rhythm of cooking. Meals may have been simple, but they were shared, passed around at wooden trestle tables with laughter, a few complaints about the consistency of the turnip mash, and perhaps a sleepy toddler falling into the pot at least once per season. Even ordinary ingredients sang softly when nestled together in a pot over a fire, with the occasional bark from a neighbor's dog and smoke curling lazily toward the rafters. And now, as our pottage burbles peacefully alongside a loaf of something vaguely resembling bread, our medieval cook turns their attention to a very important part of the domestic day: the humble task of keeping things from spoiling, rotting, being stolen by cats, or walked off with by morally ambiguous chickens, but all in good time. The Middle Ages had a funny little habit of being deeply practical, while appearing utterly bonkers to modern eyes. Nowhere was this more evident than in the humble art of food preservation, where ingenuity and paranoia waltzed together like two old peasants at a midsummer feast. Picture a medieval villager named Oswin. Oswin was not particularly remarkable, though he would have you believe his pickled turnips could wake the dead. But he was deeply devoted to the idea that winter might eat him alive if he didn't think ahead. Most people in medieval Europe lived in the eternal fear of running out of food when the frost came and all the plants curled up their toes in defeat. So Oswin had a plan, and perhaps too much salt. Salt, in fact, was less a seasoning and more a lifestyle. It preserved everything from pork to pike to questionable sausages, filled with mystery and optimism. Without refrigeration, people had to get creative. And by creative, I mean they salted things until the meat wished it were a vegetable. Meats would be buried in barrels full of coarse salt, stacked in storerooms that somehow always smelled faintly of damp dog and last year's cabbage. Some households even had a designated salt barrel bigger than the family's only child. But salt wasn't the only trick they had up their woolen, slightly itchy sleeves. Smoking was another popular preservation method, an activity that gave meat a smoked flavor and small huts an air of patient doom. Families would suspend meat up near the roof, above an open fire, and let the smoke do its work. It took days, sometimes weeks, of gentle but relentless clouding, until the meat hardened into something with the texture of an old slipper. Delicious back then. Possibly still chewable, if you were lucky, and had strong teeth, which many peasants did not. Then there was drying. Crops or herbs would be hung from rafters like botanical chandeliers, strings of onions, garlands of sage, and sprigs of lavender swaying gently when the wind whispered through the thatch. If you entered a peasant kitchen in October, it may have resembled a very small, very enthusiastic market stall run by witches. In truly dramatic culinary households, food might even be stored in pits. Yes, literal holes in the ground. Into these pits went root vegetables, cheeses, and other earthy delights, all carefully placed and then covered to stay cool and secret. These rustic pantries were not exactly secure though. More than one medieval tax ledger refers to disputes between neighbours over turnip theft, which sounds adorable until your winter stew starts looking suspiciously thin. Interestingly, not all preservation was successful or entirely safe. Fermenting, while magical in theory, sometimes crossed into science fiction. Sauerkraut was a reliable friend, but suspicious brews in unmarked pots lurked with the potential to either cure scurvy or invite hallucinations. Many dire illnesses of the day began with the innocent phrase, "Oswin dared me to try it." Now we can't discuss preservation without giving a nod to the original storage wizard, the medieval wife. She wielded pots, crocks, and common sense in equal measure. The best food keepers could make a wheel of cheese last 9 months and a smoked ham an entire winter. Housewives became human barometers, able to smell a stew and tell precisely how many Thursdays it had left in it. Recipes were passed down with phrases like boil a fortnight, then leave to rest until slightly alarmed, and the seasons dictated much of the process. Summer was the season of frantic drying, salting, pickling, burying, bottling, and muttered spells whispered into crockpots. Autumn was for stockpiling and quiet panic. By winter, the cupboards were hopefully full, if not cheerful, at least not growling. Even drinks were preserved. Spiced wine, known ominously as hippocras, was mulled and stored sweet. Ale was brewed thick as porridge, and mead hummed gently in cellars like sleepy bees organizing secret feasts. All this effort wasn't about gourmet aspirations. It was survival, with a pinch of mysticism and more than one accident involving a wayward goose. Food preservation, in the Middle Ages, was less a method and more a mindset. It was about preparing for scarcity, for unpredictability, for that universal moment when, in the deep bite of February, you discover one last turnip laughing in the dark. But while the pantry spoke of the future, the cooking hearth spoke of now. The crackling flames, the bubbling pots, the hush of nearby chores. It was at this cozy hearth that meals came to life. And it's there, at the smoky hearth fire, where we'll pause, just as an onion hisses into butter and something delicious begins to sizzle. A rooster crows somewhere far across the fog-draped moors, but no one pays it much attention. The village has been awake for hours. Bread doesn't wait, neither do goats. Meanwhile, somewhere in a thatched cottage, a woman named Matilda, woolen sleeves dusted in flour, and a wooden spoon tucked behind one ear like an ambitious feather, yawns like a dignified cat. Morning in the medieval household begins not with coffee, tragically not invented here, but with the fire, the sacred hearth, the flickering heart of the home. Without it, nothing cooks, no one eats, and your toes freeze right off your feet again. Which happened to old Leonard once. He still swears he's got phantom frost on his left pinky toe, though the rest of him is positively toasty. Fire, in the Middle Ages, was both your best friend and a badly behaved roommate. It required constant feeding, frequent flattery, and the occasional sharp word when it tried to wander. Matilda starts her day by coaxing yesterday's embers back to life, crooning to them like a hopeful chicken whisperer. A puff of smoke, a crackle, victory. Water must be fetched. Cooking without water is, as you can imagine, somewhat challenging, and medieval kitchens did not yet feature the convenience of knobs and faucets. That meant early morning walks to the well, sometimes helmeted in a shawl, always armed with a bucket and dreams of not spilling. The well, though cold and mysterious, is also mildly gossip-prone. An excellent place to hear who overcooked their pottage or who's been hiding extra onions in their apron. With water sloshing back home and a fire cheerfully stretching its flames, Matilda sets about making breakfast, or what passed for it. The Middle Ages were not big believers in brunch. No eggs Benedict, no frothy cappuccinos, and certainly no mimosa pyramids, unless someone was hoarding oranges, which would have been both impressive and highly suspicious. Still, food is food, and breakfast often meant yesterday's bread and a sip of something. Safe, which in medieval terms usually meant ale. Yes, even in the morning. Ale was often safer than water, having been boiled during brewing, and had the added benefit of making your neighbours' singing seem tolerable at sunrise. Bread was the true morning monarch though, usually coarse barley or rye, depending on your station in life and your proximity to someone who knew a miller. Nobles had white bread, the sort that disintegrates gently into soup. Everyone else had something closer to edible sponge meat dense brick, which, to be fair, is filling, especially when dunked. By mid-morning, the kitchen begins to hum, a harp tuned to the key of bubbling pots and grumbling stomachs. Most cooking was done in these humble hearths, directly over open flames. Suspended iron pots, wooden spoons blackened at the tips, and clever stone arrangements that doubled as little medieval stovetops. One could stew a rabbit, roast a pigeon, or scorch a porridge all before lunch if one was feeling ambitious or forgetful. But let us not forget, you cooked what you had. No grocery stores, no overnight shipping. Produce was seasonal, meat was occasional, and spices were the stuff of legends unless you'd married a merchant with suspiciously spicy pockets. Salt was a treasure, bacon a blessing, and cheese a way to cope with all of the milk you didn't know what to do with. In the corner of the kitchen, a child grinds grains on the quern, a handstone mill that takes optimism and superhuman forearms. The rhythm is slow and hypnotic, like the sound of bees arguing politely. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the grain whispering its complaints. This again, at least turned me into cake. But cake is a distant dream for most villagers. Daily fare was more practical. Pottage, everyone's favourite non-specific stew, bubbled constantly over the fire, a medieval slow cooker that never quite stopped. You tossed in grains, herbs, maybe a stray carrot or two. Leftovers? Absolutely. Mystery greens from the hedgerow? Delightful. Small handful of crushed dreams. Optional, but authentic. The scent of garlic and leeks drifts upward, mingling with chimney smoke. And so, the household breathes through its hearth, warming bellies and hearts, layer by comforting layer. Outside, the sun lumbers toward its midday peak, chasing shadows behind barns and under hedges. But inside, Matilda tastes the broth, nods once in approval, and reaches for her herb bundle, tied together with what she insists is the string from an angel's shoe. And just as the pot hisses a gentle promise of lunch, a knock comes at the door. Not a loud one, just low, polite, almost secretive. Who could it be? A neighbour? A peddler? Or perhaps someone in dire need of a turnip? Let's see what's cooking just beyond the threshold. The sun hung low over the thatched rooftops like a lazy yoke in the sky, casting honey-coloured light across the narrow lanes of the medieval village. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp wool, and, if you were lucky enough to pass by a cook fire, a parsnip that had been stewing for the better part of the afternoon. Inside cottages no larger than broom closets with attic ambitions, the heartbeat of evening began in earnest. It was time to prepare dinner. Or, well, the meal that would prevent untimely fainting before daybreak. You see, meals in the Middle Ages weren't so much three square affairs as they were opportunities to not die of hunger. For the average peasant, dinner wasn't a candlelit affair with violins and roast duck. It was more of a predictable performance of bubbling pot and stale crusts. But oh, the ingenuity that lived in those pots. Let's wander into the kitchen nook, if we can call a soot-darkened corner of a single-room house a nook. There are no marble countertops, no spice racks shaped like windmills, and certainly no soap carved into inspirational messages. No, here we have a cauldron hanging stoically over the fire like a silent, boil-covered sentinel. And inside that iron stomach, likely pottage, the medieval answer to everything from hunger to sadness to poor crop yields. Pottage was an eternal stew, a simmering, shifting mixture of grains, water, vegetables when they could be spared, and anything else edible that hadn't fled of its own accord. Imagine Tuesday, barley and onions. Wednesday, barley, onions and a carrot no one trusts. Thursday, someone found a piece of bacon rind. Party hats on, and it wasn't wasteful. Not at all. Leftovers from the pottage weren't just saved. They were treasured, mourned when gone, and occasionally boiled again until they surrendered their last molecules of flavor unto the broth tide. If dinner had a mascot in the medieval home, it wouldn't be an elegant chicken roasting on a spit. It would be the oppressively loyal pottage cauldron, constant, bubbling, and a little too willing to accept donations of mystery turnips. Now, you might wonder, what was used to flavor this earnest fare? Spices, or rather, the idea of spices. For those in humble cottages, flavor came in the form of herbs from the garden or hedgerow, if one had a garden or a hedgerow, or knew what plants wouldn't kill you. Thyme, parsley, maybe a splash of wild garlic if no one else had foraged it first. Salt was treasured like treasure, often taxed and more valuable than a particularly well-behaved goat. Pepper, cinnamon, those were for the rich folks, the ones with actual kitchens and spoons that didn't bend when you looked at them the wrong way. Of course, it wasn't only the ingredients that mattered. The tools were just as rustic. The humble wooden spoon, splintered, stained, possibly haunted, was the trusted companion of every aspiring cook. Knives were multi-purpose affairs used for everything from slicing leeks to convincing a sack of flour to give up just one more cup. And there was the fire, the indispensable flame that refused to cooperate during damp spells, which was 70% of the year in most places. Lighting a fire was a skill somewhere between wizardry and inappropriate pleading. Now, lest we forget the overwhelming presence of bread. Bread, dear sleepy traveler, was not just food. It was lifeblood. It was currency. It was plate. Some families would sniff bread at dinner time and call it a feast. Coarse dark loaves made of rye or barley were common among common folk, chewy, slightly bitter, and enthusiastic about crumbling into soup. And in leaner times, bakers might secretly add crushed beans, peas, or even tree bark to stretch their dough further. History is unclear on whether anyone ever accidentally baked a squirrel. We choose not to ask. And if a family was lucky, truly lucky, there would be a thin slice of cheese to share. Tangy, salty, and possibly aged underground with the enthusiastic help of time and ambient mold. Cheese was breakfast and dessert all in one. It was revenge against long winters and proof that cows were capable of producing miracles. So you see, dinner in the Middle Ages wasn't fancy, but it was marvelously inventive and deeply communal. Recipes weren't written down as much as handed down by word of mouth and memory. A handful of this, a pinch of that, until it smells right. The kitchen was rarely quiet, filled with the soft din of bubbling broth, the clink of wooden ladles, and the occasional mewl from a cat expecting a cut of something it did not deserve. As the last embers of the fire settled into a low, glowing hush, and the pottage rested for its next slow resurrection, we drift onward to the mysteries of what these humble meals were actually eaten on, or eaten with, or whether forks were yet anything more than oddly long sewing needles with aspirations. As the misty morning winds curled around the thatched rooftops of medieval villages, life below stirred in quiet, yawning rhythm. And somewhere between the first rooster's commentary and the creaking of shutters, someone had to figure out what was for breakfast. The notion of breakfast in the Middle Ages, dear dreamer, was less a feast and more a whisper, an echo of modern routines, but with fewer options and more wood smoke. For peasants, who made up the cosy bulk of the population, the morning meal was often called le petit déjeuner, which, roughly translated from medieval muttering, means whatever crumbles remain from last night. Picture it, a chunk of dark, coarse rye bread, perhaps soaked in ale if their dental insurance was non-existent, which it was, maybe a smear of dripping, animal fat collected from previous meals, or a clove of garlic for those attempting to ward off both illness and in-laws. They didn't break their fast with eggs and bacon so much as sneak past it, hoping it wouldn't notice. Now, the concept of 3 structured meals a day was a late bloomer. In the earlier parts of the Middle Ages, folks typically ate twice, once around mid-morning and again at dusk. Breakfast was loosely reserved for the very old, the very young, or people so hungry they didn't care if the monks frowned at them for doing it. Yes, dear listener, the monks had opinions. Everything from washing on Sundays to eating before prayers. It was a judgmental time to be hungry. For those who lived under monastic roofs, food and time were sacred allies. Monks observed structured hours devoted to divine matters and to porridge. In the cloisters, breakfast might include warm gruel, served plain unless a benevolent abbess deemed the day worthy of honey. Spare a reverent sigh for Brother Bernard, whose rebellion once included sneaking a fig into morning barley mash. He was punished with a stern look and 18 minutes of additional contemplation. Spicy stuff. But back among the common folk, what you ate and when depended entirely on your class, your region, and how unfortunate your recent harvest had been. In wealthier households, where chickens occasionally outnumbered fleas, breakfast might involve cheese, bread soft enough not to spark a dental emergency, and eggs lovingly poached in wine. Yes, wine. Because water, especially in cities, was sometimes less clear spring and more mildly plague adjacent. Ale, on the other hand, was the MVP of medieval hydration. A low alcohol ale, called small beer, was consumed throughout the day, breakfast included. It wasn't so much a beverage as it was a way of life. Even children drank it, which rather explains why medieval toddlers walked like small, shouty pirates. A curious dish often found on manor tables was panada, a thin, brothy affair made of bread soaked in warm liquid, occasionally brightened with spices if the cook was both inspired and likely in love. This wasn't just resourceful, it was medieval comfort food. Picture the love child of soup and soggy toast, tenderly lapped up from pewter bowls by bleary-eyed nobles in fur-trimmed robes who had spent the previous evening debating the ethical implications of lancet warfare. Let us not forget the foods eaten not for nourishment, but for protection. The mysterious holy bread, blessed by clergy, was consumed to guard against poison and indigestion, which, if we're honest, were probably the same thing. Superstition and nutrition often shared a table, trading glances over a plate of heavily peppered pottage. And if you thought breakfast lacked excitement, consider this. In periods of fasting, which the church insisted upon with the enthusiasm of a zealous trainer at a medieval gym, meat was off limits. Fish, however, slipped through the theological net. Enter the era of breakfast eels and dried herring, seasoned with piety and mild disappointment. Still, whether noble or knave, monk or miller, most folk greeted the day with something warm in the belly and a purpose in the hands. They ate, standing in doorways, sitting on barrels, or squatting creekside with their feet in the dew. Breakfast was not a meal of leisure, so much as a quiet nod to survival. Now, as the sun lazily stretches across the fields, trailing its golden fingers across kitchen hearths and tilting thatch, the medieval world prepares for its true culinary challenge, the midday meal. For while breakfast dared to be humble, dinner, well, that was where drama and gravy often met in glorious alliance. In the mellow hush of a medieval evening, when the sun slouched lazily behind the thatched roofs and chimney smoke blended into the indigo sky like a sleepy sigh, kitchens across the village began their nightly rituals. Though kitchen may be a wildly generous term, in reality, most homes made do with a modest hearth, a few battered pots, and the unshakable hope that no chickens walked straight through the stew. The hearth was the heart of the home, and no, that's not just poetic sentiment, although we do enjoy a little poetry before bedtime. It was literally the warmest place in the house. And since the Middle Ages hadn't quite invented central heating, or roofs that didn't leak, the hearth pulled double duty. It cooked your food and prevented your toes from freezing off. Now, in case you're imagining a roaring fireplace gracefully surrounded by stone arches and brass pokers, slow down your gallop, noble dream rider. The poorer households had something closer to a smoky pit in the floor, with a few rocks for balance and a blackened kettle that had seen better centuries. If you had a ceiling with a hole poked in it to let the smoke drift out, you were living the medieval version of high society. Cooking over an open hearth required a kind of rugged, barefoot ballet, balanced between dangling pots, crackling flames, and the very real threat of a goose-related sabotage. The medieval cook needed skills, and possibly a sixth sense. Meals, like the fire itself, were built slowly. Bread was not the fluffy, Instagrammable loaf we know today. Bread was, firm, sturdy, emotionally distant. It was often made from coarsely ground grains like rye or barley. Wheat was for the rich, darling. The peasants didn't get any of that golden, billowy nonsense. Their bread could blunt a dagger and survive small floods. Pottage was the true menu star. Imagine a thick, earthy stew that started with water, grain, and maybe a few root vegetables. Then, as the week progressed, and if you were lucky, a pigeon might fall in. Basically, the pot never emptied. It just simmered endlessly as vegetable scraps, bits of bacon rind, and the occasional mysterious object, perhaps a forgotten spoon or a very confused frog, were tossed in. This infinite stew was affectionately called perpetual pottage, which sounds like a dish from a magical boarding school. but was really just the medieval equivalent of leftovers that got weird over time. And then there was flavour. Flavour in the Middle Ages was, let's say, experimental. Spices were wildly expensive if you weren't nobility, so most folks relied on herbs they could grow or forage. Things like parsley, sage, garlic, onions, and whatever leafy thing hadn't been trampled by livestock. Salt, if available, was precious. You didn't just sprinkle it casually like a modern chef in slow motion. You rationed it like gold dust handed down through generations. That said, some villages actually developed clever communal systems. Medieval cookery was social. People baked dough in communal ovens, borrowed spits and cauldrons, and even shared recipes, not written down, of course, but passed along by lip and ladle. Speaking of communal cooking, let us not skip over the joy of feast days. These were the infrequent but wildly exciting times when meat, glorious, sizzling, exceedingly rare meat, made an appearance on your crude wooden plate. A neighbour might slaughter a pig, and suddenly, everyone in the village turned up with a bowl, a bottle of ale, and their best attempt at a smile, even if their teeth had mostly retired by age 27. The pig, by the way, wasn't so much butchered as celebrated. Every bit was used. Blood became puddings, the stomach became sausage casing, and the squeal, well, that echoed through the countryside like the horn of Gondor, summoning all hungry souls. But even ordinary days had their little joys. A well-baked oatcake, a mug of mulled ale gently warmed at the hearth, the sweet smoky smell of apples drying near the rafters for winter. Nights might be long, cold, and rich with the perfume of nearby goats, but a humble meal could bind people together, quietly, tenderly. So next time you microwave leftover spaghetti at midnight, perhaps raise your fork to the hard-working medieval cook. They laboured a little longer, stirred a little slower, and likely did it all while wearing itchy wool and fending off a particularly aggressive cat. And now, with your belly full of ancient stew dreams and a hearth flickering gently in your imagination, let us wander towards something sweeter still, where honey cakes and mead begin to whisper from the shadows of the past. On the eastern edge of a bustling medieval village, just far enough from the market square to avoid a surprise collision with a goat cart, but close enough to hear the blacksmith's hammer complaining about another long day. A woman stood hunched beside her hearth. The fire flickered with a low, contented crackle, like it had recently eaten and couldn't be bothered to do much else. Her name was Edith, which was the medieval equivalent of being named Linda or Barbara today. Respectable, practical, and usually accompanied by a worry about whether the rye bread would rise properly this time. Edith, like many other wives, mothers, sisters, and cunningly efficient grandmothers of the time, was a maestro of the medieval meal. Though she'd never put it like that. She'd have said she was just getting the food on the board. Never mind the tightrope walk between keeping everyone full and not burning down the cottage with overly ambitious pottage. Her kitchen was not a room. It was more of a state of being. Most medieval homes, especially those in villages, had a fire pit in the center of the single-room dwelling, with a cauldron swinging above it like a lazy pendulum of dinner possibility. Smoke rose hesitantly through the thatch, searching for a way out. Chimneys were still considered luxurious contraptions for the wealthy or the wishful thinkers. For Edith, the shifting smoke did double duty, flavouring the stew and keeping the flies just annoyed enough to stay airborne. Tonight, she was making a pottage. Again, because she always was. Pottage was the medieval jack-of-all ladles, a thick stew made from whatever you had, plus a little wishful seasoning. Barley, leeks, a turnip or two, and maybe, if today was market day, a scrap of bacon that had been cured so thoroughly it might come back to life out of spite. But here's the secret. Edith's pottage wasn't a daily reset. It was a never-ending culinary relay. One pot, many days, ingredients forever changing. It simmered constantly. New vegetables went in. Yesterday's turnip went out, presumably because it had become self-aware. Children would sneak a ladle when mother wasn't looking, and the dish would adapt to their meddling like a sentient soup. This method, called a perpetual stew, was quite literally bottomless. Some villages kept their communal stew going for weeks, others, legends claim, for months. It's not clear if that's dedication, laziness, or a clever way to avoid washing the pot. And as for seasoning, salt was a treasure and often locked in a box like a magical talisman. Spices like pepper or cinnamon were imported at great cost and used like ancient perfume, precisely, sparingly, and always with a story about how much it cost Cousin Henry that time he sneezed into the bag. Garlic was more common, as were herbs like parsley or sage, picked by curious hands and often second-guessed. The medieval cook didn't have recipes so much as instincts, helped along by oral tradition, gently aggressive aunts, and yes, the occasional holy vision about adding a sprig of thyme. Bread was, of course, the eternal companion to every medieval meal. Not fluffy or golden-crusted like our modern loaves, oh no. These were dense, earthy, toothsome hunks that could be thrown at geese or used to shore up foundations. And if you were especially lucky in your daily baking, your bread wouldn't collapse into a sad, edible brick due to under-kneading or a grumpy yeast. Sometimes, they didn't even eat their trenchers, the thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates, often soaked in pottage and handed to the poor after the meal. Noble generosity or clever recycling? Difficult to say. But perhaps the most charming part of this whole smoky, bubbling culinary ballet is that meals, for all their simplicity, were deeply social. The family squatted around the fire like cozy conspirators, sharing news, songs, and occasionally debating whether lentils were worth the flatulence. And while forks hadn't fully arrived yet in the average home, hands and knives did the trick just fine. Thank you. Edith stirred her pot, added a dash of ground mustard she'd been saving, and let the mixture sigh gently into the evening. Another meal nearly done. Another round of survival served up with a ladle and a bit of love. Outside, the last orange light of day flirted with the cottage walls, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster with questionable judgment crowed sleepily. And just as Edith pinched out the flame with a practiced snuff, her husband arrived with a surprise. A rabbit, slightly dented, possibly bartered. Now what, dear cook? Will you do with that? Let's see what the cauldron thinks. While the castle kitchens blazed with iron spits, and the manor house simmered quietly with its bubbling pottages, let us float a little further downstream, away from noble courts and burgher feasts, straight into the very heart of medieval domesticity, the humble peasant hearth. Here, dear sleeper of centuries, is where things simmered slowly, and not just because everyone was waiting patiently for the beans to cook, although yes, that too. Picture a modest timber cottage, its roof angled low, daubed with the sticky mix of clay, straw, and the unspoken contribution of passing livestock. The smoke spiraled out through a hole in the roof because chimneys, back then, were still something of an aristocratic indulgence. Inside, the air was a bouquet of damp wood, drying herbs, and the familial aroma of turnips. At the centre of it all, a fire. Not a grand hearth dressed with brass and candelabras, but a sunken pit, or, in slightly fancier circumstances, a raised stone enclosure. Above it hung an iron pot suspended on a trammel, which, to the uninitiated, is a sort of adjustable hook and chain mechanism, a clever contraption invented by someone who liked their stew at precisely the mid-boil level. Meal planning was a flexible art form for the medieval peasant. It began with a single, haunting question: what do we have? And the answer, more often than not, was this turnip, a questionable onion, and possibly a barley kernel someone found in the folds of their tunic. Enter the gruel, the most misunderstood dish of all time. It wasn't just sad porridge. It was cuisine shaped by necessity and a suspicious relationship with water quality. In the absence of meat, which was taxed, forbidden, or simply not there, grains became the unsung heroes of every home-cooked meal. Barley, rye, oats, all boiled to within an inch of their structural integrity and laced with anything remotely edible. Nettles, leeks, acorns, or the occasional luck of a bird feather found in the hedgerow. Even the utensils whispered of rustic poetry: spoons carved from wood, bowls shared communally, and knives that you carried on your belt like cutlery cowboys. Forks, not quite yet. Forks were still lingering suspiciously in their Byzantine niche, considered slightly sinful, or at least French. Still, the food wasn't always meager. The rhythm of the farming calendar brought seasonal delights. Summer meant strawberries and wild herbs. Autumn brought a festival of nuts, apples, and things that could be safely pickled. And pickled they were. Preservation wasn't cute, it was vital. Medieval cellars were not full of Instagram-worthy canning jars, but clay pots sealed with lard or wax, guarding precious pickles of beetroot or fermented cabbage with the sternness of a moody monk. Speaking of fermentation, we've now gently ambled our way to ale. Yes, even the peasantry enjoyed a bit of bubbly. Water, as we've touched upon, was a risky venture, a microbial roulette wheel. Small ale, a weekly brewed beer, was often the safer bet and was consumed by everyone, including children. Forget milk. Little Wulfstan and Elfgifu were probably sipping a light lunch of porridge and ale like tired miniature dockworkers. Women were the sovereigns of this culinary kingdom. The lady of the house brewed the ale, baked the bread, and stirred the pottage, usually all at once, while also raising a half-dozen children and shooing a goose out from under the table. Bread, by the way, deserves its own standing ovation. Peasant bread was coarse and tough, not unlike the people who made it. It filled your belly, doubled as a plate when made into trenchers, and developed enough structural fortitude to be used as a missile if dinner didn't satisfy. But not all was bleak gruel and cabbage wind. Festive days brought feasts, modest certainly, but bursting with joy. Pancakes on Shrove Tuesday, roasted bits of pig on Saints' Days, and mystery pies that may or may not contain a borrowed pigeon. The community came together to eat, gossip, and eat again. Laughter echoed off wattle and daub walls, warmed by fire and fortified with dill-sprinkled hope. And as the fire dimmed and families tucked into their straw mattresses dressed with coarse linen and sleepy sighs, the last embers popped beneath the kettle. Tomorrow's pottage would be richer for the flavors of overnight scorched onions, an unintentional rustic delicacy. So rest now, warm traveller in time. For as dawn breaks in this age of wool and wood, our next stirring tale bubbles gently on the hob, waiting to be ladled out, one steaming spoon at a time. When we drift back to the kitchens of the Middle Ages, Whiffs of wood smoke and rosemary still trail through the air. By this point in our sleep-laced journey, the hearth has become a rather familiar character, glowing with pride, soot on its cheeks, faithfully crackling in a corner like someone who's been waiting to be asked about their sourdough starter. But let us, for a moment, step briefly away from the serious business of stews and grain porridge to explore a charming oddity, the world of medieval condiments. Yes, even in the 14th century, people wanted their food to taste like something, preferably something better than boiled yesterday and forgotten until Thursday. Now, we mustn't judge them too harshly. They didn't have salt and vinegar chips or packets of ketchup knocking about. Yet, through sheer inventiveness and possibly boredom, medieval cooks fashioned their own flavor enhancers with names like garum, verjuice, and mustard, the last of which will be quite familiar if you've ever mistaken it for a banana milkshake at a picnic and deeply regretted it. Take mustard for starters. A humble seed, mashed diligently with vinegar or sour wine, sometimes spruced with spices or honey. It was adored for its pungency and, let's be honest, its ability to mask the taste of meat that had crossed the border into questionably edible. Its production was so taken to heart that monks in Dijon were at one point the region's most blessed condiment artisans, filling parchment scrolls with recipes and possibly arguments over whether the mustard pairs better with eel or dried squirrel. Magic in a crock. Then there was verjuice, a gloriously gentle souring agent made from unripe grapes. It sounds like a medieval prank, doesn't it? Quick, let's pick the grapes they haven't ripened yet and squeeze them into a tart little potion. And yet, it worked. Verjuice softened the sharpness of sauces and added a whisper of elegance to otherwise clunky meat dishes. A culinary middle note, if you will, like a viola in a brass band. Garum, however, was another beast entirely, hailing from Roman days and lurking stubbornly into the medieval period. Garum was a fermented fish sauce, and when I say fermented, I mean left out in the sun with fish bits until it stopped being fish and started being sauce, in the same way that enough time will eventually turn milk into either cheese or a neighborhood emergency. Now, not everyone in medieval Europe flung garum into their dinner, but variants of fermented marinades popped up with suspicious enthusiasm in different places. And why not? Life was short, winter was long, and if a salty, savory elixir of mysterious origin could revive the flavor of a dry sausage or a boring turnip, who were we to judge? In fact, many flavorings from the time were so treasured that they were stored and guarded like treasures. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, or peppercorns were as prized as gemstones and could be locked away in tiny, ornate boxes, often more secure than the local tax collection. Owning a sprinkle of pepper was like having a subscription to every streaming service and not sharing the password. But condiments weren't simply culinary accessories. They carried with them the whiff of medicine and magic. Sage for your memory, garlic for your courage, vinegar to keep the humours in balance and possibly ward off plague. But don't quote me on that. Medieval people didn't separate the body from the banquet. Food was sustenance, potion, and therapy all in one. That can of mustard in your fridge may not heal your inner turmoil, but in 1382, it was practically a counsellor. And in kitchens both noble and humble, these flavourings were stirred thoughtfully into pots, rubbed onto meats, drizzled onto roasts, or, if you misbehaved, perhaps dunked in wholesale, and served just to teach you a lesson about humility. Indeed, we might never know which medieval chef first gasped, "Aha, it just needs more vinegar." but we can respect the culinary courage it took to find out. So, as we lean back into the fragrant shadow of that smoky kitchen, candlelight flickering over sticky little jars, we may picture the medieval cook carefully pinching spices with the same reverence a monk might handle sacred scrolls, tenderly tipping mustard into a bowl like a fledgling alchemist. And just beyond the hearth's glow, a loaf of bread begins to cool. Not just any bread, but the crusty, chewy, deliciously ordinary kind that someone labored over, kneaded by candlelight and baked against hot stones. We've tasted the sauces. Now it's time we meet the bread. In the sweet lull before twilight, when the chimneys yawn their smoky whispers over rooftops and hens nested in contented huddles, we find ourselves drifting deeper into the kitchens of medieval villages. Not the grand feasting halls full of boor and jesters, but the homely little hearths, where soup bubbled more than status, and a carrot was considered a proper treasure. Picture now a room barely bigger than a cupboard, if you please, stone-walled, draft-battled, cloaked in the faint perfume of peat smoke and onions, always onions. There, leaning over an iron pot dangling from a sooty hook, is a woman named Elfgifu, her name meaning gift of elves, which was tremendously poetic, considering her only known magic was the ability to make turnips vaguely delightful. Now, Elfgifu cooked as most did, without a recipe, without a clock, and with a healthy respect for what the garden coughed up that week. The rhythm of her days wasn't set by a calendar, but by the mood of her cabbage and the temperament of her goat, who may or may not give milk based on her feelings toward the weather, the stars, or the neighbor's rooster. Most cooking was done over a fire, the kind of fire that sulked a little before bursting into action, and never seemed to heat evenly no matter how nicely you asked. The pot, often the most cherished item in the household, was a good, loyal thing. Blackened by years of use, it held pottage. Ah yes, the dish of the ages, eternal, nutritious, and only slightly confusing. Pottage was not so much a dish as it was a lifestyle, a hearty stew that simmered and evolved throughout the week, with ingredients coming and going like house guests. One day, it might be oat-thickened and oniony, and the next invaded by a generous spoonful of yesterday's barley and a modest flotilla of beans. If one were lucky, a fateful turnip might join the festivities. Meat? Well, on Tuesdays never, on Saints' Days maybe, and sometimes, if a chicken had a particularly tragic day on the road, yes. But more often, pottage was vegetarian, not by design, but by economic fate. Spices were not so much added as worshipped. A clove of garlic was considered practically cosmopolitan. As for exotic imports like pepper, well, you'd sooner see a unicorn delivering mail. Salt, however, was essential. Status symbol and preservation magic, all in one. Salted fish was the fridge of its day, and although it smelled like Neptune's laundry basket, it kept bellies full through the lean months. Breakfast, or what passed for it, might be a cold scrap of bread if there was any, or a ladle of leftover pottage if it survived the night. There was no cereal box in sight, unless you count a wooden container of barley gruel, which even then was cheerfully considered a bit plain. Still, villagers were sturdy, and hunger, though frequent, met its match in hearty, muddy-footed perseverance. And let us not forget bread, the grand anchor of the medieval table. The wealthier folk had soft, yeasty loaves of finer sifted flour, though only fools passed up the caloric might of a chunky wholemeal round. For the lower classes, it often contained whatever grain was on hand, mixed sometimes with peas or beans, or even, if fortune fumbled an idea, ground up tree bark, a filler, they said, a fibrous, splinter-laden filler. Baking happened communally in many places, since not every home was blessed with its own oven. Instead, villagers would prepare their dough and trot it over to the village bakehouse, where, for a modest fee or a barter of fresh eggs, the baker would slip it into the great oven alongside everyone else's humble rounds. If you mixed up your loaves with your neighbours, well, congratulations, surprise dinner. It wasn't all gloom and rutabagas though. On feast days, great labours unfolded in even the smallest kitchens. Pies filled with chopped apples and drizzled honey, spiced if you were rich or daring. Pancakes of sorts made with oat flour and fried in boar fat. And celebration ales brewed in cracked barrels by women known lovingly as alewives, who probably invented every hangover north of Canterbury. Candles flickered low now. Elfgifu stirred her pot once more, then gave a satisfied nod to the clay cups warming near the hearth. There would be pottage tonight, of course, but also a crisp piece of rye bread and a whisper of dried sage, saved from the summer garden. Luxury. Out in the dark, the stars peered down lazily through bullseye glass and thatched roofs. The embers softened to a dusky orange, and the village exhaled. As night glides gently on, our thoughts begin to turn from soups and stews to what all those dreamy fine folks drank with their humble meals, and perhaps what mischief the ale might brew. And so, we arrive at the fire, hissing, crackling, and fussing like an old aunt trying to light a candle in a windy chapel. Because in the Middle Ages, when it came to cooking, everything, absolutely everything, revolved around controlling fire, or rather, pretending you had any. Control it all, and hoping your dinner didn't turn into a scorched sacrifice to the kitchen spirits. Let us imagine, if you please, a modest peasant dwelling, its walls timbered and earth-smelling, the air dense with the smoky perfume of damp wood and stewing onions. In the centre, the hearth, a noble patch of open flame occasionally persuaded into cooperation with the help of bellows, patience, and a wildly hopeful attitude. Now, this wasn't the sleek stovetop your modern sensibilities might expect. No knobs, no dials, just fire, a few iron tools, and the carefully cultivated fear of burning an entire month's food in a matter of minutes. A surprisingly motivating fear, I must say. Hanging over the hearth or nestled beside it were pots, kettles, and cauldrons made of iron or clay. These utensils were not dainty. They were not graceful. They were more like the sort of kitchen equipment you'd wield in battle if a war randomly broke out during supper. And sometimes, when cooking among family, it did. To simmer something, say, a pottage thick with barley and maybe a carrot or two that survived the neighbour's goats, you'd dangle your heavy cauldron on an adjustable hook over the flame. This hook was called a trammel, although that word also sounds suspiciously like a bird with excellent manners. Raising or lowering the pot adjusted the heat. Too close to the flame and your stew adopted the complex aroma of burnt everything. Too far, and you might as well have been sharing a raw turnip by candlelight. Firewood wasn't just a necessity. It was a resource to be managed as carefully as spices or affection. For the rural poor, gathering wood could take several hours and an uncomfortable number of thorn scratches. But without it, there was no hot meal, just cold, hard bread, and the spiritual defeat of onion breath at room temperature. Still, resourceful minds found ways to stretch their heat. Many homes had what you might generously call an oven. a beehive-shaped affair made of clay, usually located outside and protected from the elements by a lean-to, or, optimistically, a wheelbarrow leaned on its side. You'd build a fire inside this low stone igloo, then scrape out the embers and pop in your bread dough or meat pasties. It was a high-risk endeavour. There was no side window or temperature gauge, just your own burnt fingers and the hopeful sniff of smoke that smelled only slightly like singed hair. In noble households, of course, things were rather more enthusiastic. Here, the kitchens were often separate buildings entirely, lest an overzealous cook burn down the manor because they lost track of a goose. These kitchens boasted great open hearths and chimney hoods, wide enough to house a choir of chimney sweeps. There might be multiple fires flickering at once, each one babysat by its own specialized team of kitchen minions, some turning spits, others stirring pots, and one poor soul whose job was only to squint at the fire and pretend to know what they were doing. A favoured technique was cooking on a spit, roasting whole animals slowly over the flames, basted with anything from vinegar and salt to ale and awkward conversation. Turning the spit was once the job of young boys or servants, but innovation eventually gave us the turnspit dog, a specially bred pup who ran in a wheel, hamster style, rotating your dinner via canine cardio. It was steam power before steam, small, furry, and slightly annoyed. However, not all meals were roasted or boiled. A clever cook could shovel coals beneath a handmade griddle for baking flatbreads or frying bits of gritty bacon. Others perfected the simmering slow dance of a stew, wherein all your edible odds and ends mingled together in the pot like an awkward medieval tavern party. Turnips, lentils, a scrap of last Sunday's mutton, and a very tired leek. And ever present was the smoke. It seeped into the walls, the clothes, the dreams. A smoky kiss clung to every dish, like the shy cousin of seasoning, quietly reminding everyone what kept them warm, fed, and slightly teary-eyed in the evenings. As the embers softened and the stew reached that magical stage where it stopped resembling soup and began resembling food, the firelight painted orange shadows across the hunched, patient figures of the household, their hands busy, their thoughts quiet, their tummies hopeful. And so, with the fire safely flickering low and the air humming with the aroma of barley and ash, we shuffle gently along to discover how one might keep a few morsels tucked away for later. For in a world without freezers or cling film, preserving food was quite the delicate art indeed. In the hush of an early medieval dawn, long before alarm clocks or oat milk lattes, the sleepy hamlets of feudal Europe began to stir, not with the melodic ding of a microwave, no, but with the slow creak of wooden shutters, the sigh of wind through thatch, and the gentle snort of a pig who really should not be sleeping in the kitchen, but most definitely is. Kitchen, of course, is a generous term. For the ordinary peasant, the cooking hearth wasn't a room unto itself so much as the warm-ish smoky corner where food vaguely happens. A single large fireplace, built into the humble structure of wattle and daub, served as oven, stove, central heating, and quite possibly town gossip headquarters. You see, a fire was not just life-sustaining, it was the Insta-story of its day. Anything interesting? Bring it to the fire. Now, you may be wondering what the medieval cook did without a spice rack or electric whisk, and the answer is the same thing we do today when we're caught without ingredients. Complain bitterly, make whatever's on hand work, and pretend you meant to do it that way all along. An ordinary household in the village wouldn't have cinnamon, saffron, or nutmeg, unless the lord of the manor was feeling particularly generous or absent-minded with his spice chest. Instead, They relied on what they could forage, grow, or trade. Wild herbs like sorrel, parsley, and sage were the key flavor makers. River mint, a lifesaver. Wild garlic, an actual medieval celebrity. Then there were the greens, the leafy lifelines picked from hedgerows and cottage gardens. Nettle, not just for stings or witchy brewings, but rather a hearty addition to pottage, a kind of medieval super soup, which would simmer over a fire for days at a time, with ingredients added and subtracted intermittently, depending on the generosity of the gods or the season. A kind of edible mood ring for the household's fortune. Bread, of course, was more than food. It was a statement piece. The daily bread might be coarse, dark, and chewy, made from barley, rye, or oats, depending on what the land provided, how the harvest went, and whether the local mill was in a good mood that week. Flour wasn't always sieved, and might include a dash of ground acorns or the occasional crunch of grit. Some medieval cooks called it texture. You could also call it dental roulette. Cooking utensils, too, were a humble affair. No stainless steel, no copper pots polished to a gleam, unless you lived in a manor, of course. For the ordinary folk, there were iron cauldrons hung over the hearth, wooden spoons worn soft from years of stirring stories into the stew, and ceramic jugs that, if smartly made, doubled as both beverage holders and effective throwing projectiles during domestic disputes. It's worth mentioning that most of the actual cooking was done by women, usually the mother or eldest daughter, sometimes a grandmother with one eye and opinions sharper than a carving knife. These women held, in their apron pockets and calloused hands, generations of knowledge, whispered down and hardly written. They knew how to preserve, ferment, and forage in ways that today would render them seven-figure culinary influencers. In good seasons, fish might be caught from streams, or meat obtained from a modest fowl or pig raised in the yard, though meat was a luxury best saved for feast days, or for when the local priest smiled upon your sins. For lean times, enter the peasant classic, gruel. A watery, warming, optimistic meal that said, perhaps tomorrow things will be thicker. But the pace of meals was slow, almost ritual. There were no timers or takeout. Meals waited until the bread had finished baking, until the stew had grown tender, until everyone had returned from the fields. It was less about convenience and more about patience. A quiet, crackling, hunger-warming patience. Time passed slowly by the fire, and so did the scent of onions roasting in lard, the gentle splash of ladle into bowl, and the hushed murmurs over coarse cloth-topped tables. And when the last spoon clinked against the bottom of the bowl, when the embers settled into a glowing bed of orange memory, it was time to begin gathering for sleep. But before that, before dreams and straw-stuffed mattresses, someone always checked the pot, just to make sure there was a little something left for tomorrow. Which brings us quietly to a candlelit thought. What of the people who cooked not in humble hearths, but in the echoing stone kitchens of noble keeps? What did they boil? What did they burn? And just who was courageous or unlucky enough to feed a medieval lord with gout and opinions? Somewhere in the sleepy hush of a 12th century village, under skies the colour of unrinsed wool, a small miracle was bubbling away in a clay pot. And no, it wasn't an alchemical elixir or the secret to eternal youth. It was pottage. Oh yes, pottage. The inescapable superstar of the medieval kitchen, the Beyoncé of peasant cuisine. Thick, dependable, and appealing in an I've got you through another plague season kind of way. Pottage, for those blissfully unfamiliar, was a sort of endlessly variable stew, always boiling, always ready to welcome whatever scraps the world provided that day. It simmered gently over the hearth, thick with cabbage one day, mysteriously beetroot red the next, and occasionally graced by the nobility of a stray turnip. Protein, if luck was kind, perhaps a morsel of salted pork or a whisper of an egg. Often, however, the protein arrived in the form of a suspiciously meaty-looking root. Folk didn't ask too many questions. They just stirred. The medieval hearth, where most of the real culinary sorcery happened, was essentially the kitchen, the living room, and central heating, all rolled into one smoky, ash-dusted corner. A suspended cauldron hung there like a great metal moon, forever steaming, stirred slow with a wooden ladle by someone with rough hands and the patience of a saint. And while the pottage did its thing, bread was the table's co-star. Not the fluffy, crusty kind we toast lovingly today, but something more akin to a chewy discus with trust issues. It was dark, dense, and mildly terrifying if dropped on one's foot. But it was hearty, and when your daily calorie intake involved chasing a pig through a muddy field, you needed hearty. Now, if you ever find yourself sleepily wondering how this bread arose, if, indeed, it did rise at all, let me introduce you to the medieval sourdough starter, also known as old dough from yesterday's loaf, or, if one was truly desperate, a scoop scooped from a neighbor with an obliging attitude and a surplus of yeast. The starter would bubble ominously on a warm hearthstone, smelling faintly like damp wheat dreams and hard-earned survival. Water, too, was a finicky acquaintance. Safe to drink? Rarely, unless you liked your intestines as dramatic as a court troubadour. So instead, people drank ale, not the kind that gets you merrily arguing about who left the chicken coop open, but a weaker, small ale that quenched thirst without inviting chaos. It was boiled in the brewing, so safer than the nearby stream, which doubled as a general-purpose dumping site and romantic strolling route. In between all this merriment, there came the occasional fish, not the glamorous kind with lemon slices and poetry. No, these came salted, dried, or smoked until they resembled edible bookmarks. Fish was as much about survival as it was about salvation, especially on Fridays and feast days when the church advised people to avoid meat, just in case eternal judgment hinged on consumption of ham. Peasants, clever and resilient as ever, turned to the rivers and ponds, pulling out eels with impressive enthusiasm. Eels, you see, were oddly abundant and surprisingly versatile. Roast them, boil them, bake them into pies. It was a real medieval choose-your-own-eel venture. And if you were truly blessed by God, nature, and a well-timed goose, you might even have an actual roast for the table. Not the Sunday roast of modern pub fame, but a sort of spit-roasted bird, mostly bone and dignity, turned slowly over the flame by someone's youngest child, or a wonderfully archaic device called a turnspit dog. Yes, an actual dog trained to trot inside a hamster wheel-type contraption to spin the roast. The medieval multitasking pet. Amid all these wonders, the humble herb garden quietly worked its sleepy magic. Honest little pots of sage, parsley, and thyme poked through the soil, adding a dash of something savory and green to otherwise joyless dishes. In truth, if you could taste thyme, it usually meant your stew wasn't entirely diluted with pond water, a cause for celebration. So, with pottage ever stewing, bread eternally baking, and an eel or two wrapped in leaves beside the hearth, the medieval kitchen carried on, simple, smoky, and surprisingly comforting. Meals might lack splendor, but they brimmed with community, with care, with the daily quiet diligence of feeding one another through the long winters and short harvests. Somewhere outside, the candle flickers slower now. A sleepy chicken murmurs in its roost. And inside, the last of the bread has gone stale, but only just. Tomorrow, it'll make excellent trenchers. But that, dear dreamer, is a story for another evening table. A silvery mist curled along the muddy lanes of a medieval village, wrapping thatched roofs and crooked chimney pots in a blanket of soft forgetfulness. The sky, smeared in hues of plum and ash, said goodbye to the sun with the dramatic flair of a bard's curtain call. Inside the cottages, gentle candlelight flickered like gossiping fireflies, whispering tales of hearths, homes, and what was for dinner. And let us now eavesdrop gently on one of those humble abodes. Imagine a small timber-framed house, its wattle and daub walls perfumed with the subtle scent of damp earth and onion. The floor is made of packed clay, unswept but well-trodden, and the center of domestic life is, unmistakably, the hearth. Not just the cozy hub for storytelling or strategically standing because it's cold everywhere else. This fire pit was the culinary engine of yesteryear. Suspended above the dancing flames was an iron pot large enough to hold a goose, a chicken, and perhaps even the vague ambitions of a turnip or two. The pot was blackened from use, but not sad about it. It was quite proud, actually, because this was the medieval version of a slow cooker, and it had been at work all day. Today's meal. Pottage. It always seemed to be pottage. A versatile stew-like affair. Pottage could be made with whatever ingredients were found, grown, borrowed, or bartered in a nearby hedge. Beans, leeks, barley, and, if fortune smiled or pigs tripped, a bit of meat might grace the pot's depths. But meat was a cameo player most days, making brief appearances like a mysterious stranger in a novel. Just enough to leave an impression. The pottage simmered eternally, being added to, stirred, and routinely thickened by yesterday's leftovers. If you thought sourdough starters were ancient, meet their sibling, perpetual stew. Legend has it some households kept their pottage going for weeks, even months. A sort of edible family heirloom. The longer it simmered, the better the flavor. Or at least, the more indistinguishable the original ingredients became, which frankly helped. Bread was the loyal companion to this never-ending stew saga, and not the fluffy cloud loaves of modern dreams, oh no. This bread had backbone, the kind of backbone that could break a lesser man's tooth. Coarse, dense, and often riddled with chaff. Medieval bread filled the belly with the tenacity of a brick with dreams. Unless, of course, you were lucky enough to enjoy trencher bread. But here lies the rustic genius. Trenchers weren't just bread. They were plates. Yes, edible dishware. Square, thick slices of stale bread served as platters, especially during feasts. After soaking up meat drippings and soup spills, they were either eaten by the diners, given to the servants, or sometimes charitably donated to the poor. Because nothing says recycling like chewing on a stranger's gravy-soaked plate. As the village night deepened and livestock muttered sleepily in far-off sheds, our pottage-brewing household gathered around the hearth. A woman ladled hot stew into coarse clay bowls, a leathery hand steady and practiced. Beside her, a child gnawed earnestly on a crust of bread, chasing imaginary knights up and down the spongy battlements of his mind. Food in the Middle Ages wasn't just about hunger. It was about survival, community, and making the most of what was at hand. Spices were rare and prized like aromatic gold. Salt kept meats from spoiling, and sometimes people too. And cooking was a balancing act between flame and faith, between hope and the day's catch, or lack thereof. If your neighbor caught a rabbit, there might be soup for two. If they caught a plague, perhaps not. Such was the delicate drama of daily life drawn in steamy ladlefuls under a thatched roof. And yet, despite the harshness of the world outside those walls, wars echoing through distant fields, taxes looming like a damp fog, inside, the rhythm of preparing food carried a kind of magic, a soft continuity humming through wood smoke and cabbage steam, unwinding the day's frayed edges into something warm, edible, and shared. The fire crackled lower now. Someone yawned. A wooden spoon rested at last, like a knight sheathing their sword. And somewhere, just beyond village borders, a market dawn waited to unfurl, filled with baskets, bargaining, and curious items of the edible and questionable variety. But that's for another evening tale, when the world stirs again under sunrise and straw dust. If you were a common villager in the Middle Ages, which I'm sure was never your career plan, but let's imagine anyway, you probably didn't own a spice rack lined with 48 varieties of powdered snobbery. In fact, most of your food wouldn't taste like much of anything that could be marketed on modern cooking shows, where life-changing seasoning blends have names like Dragon Dust or Sunrise Ember. No, your flavor palette likely relied on three things: onions, regret, and the occasional miracle involving garlic. Dinner, if the pigs hadn't eaten your barley again, meant porridge. And not the sweet, sleepy nursery rhyme kind with cream and golden curls, but a thick, greyish gruel charmingly known in historical cookbooks as pottage. This delightfully humble dish could be made from whatever you had: beans, peas, cabbage, bits of the garden that hadn't been stolen by a goat. Occasionally, they'd ladle in the remnants of a smoked pig's foot or a shudder-inducing portion of tripe. It was rustic, it was rural, it occasionally moved on its own, but there was warmth in that bowl, hearty, slow-simmered sustenance, bubbling contentedly over a low fire for hours. Cooking was as much about patience as it was about keeping the neighbor's curious chickens out of your stew. Now, unlike your TikTok-famous gourmet cousin, yes, the one from the bustling market town 4 fields over who owns 2 pots instead of 1, you likely cooked over an open hearth. Think of it as the original stovetop, but wider, smokier, and with a slightly higher chance of catching fire if the cat stumbled too close. The hearth was the heart of the home, which sounds romantic until you realize it doubled as your heating system, your nightlight, your clothes dryer, and occasionally your smoke signal to heaven. Women, and they truly carried the weight of the entire boiling pot on their shoulders, managed these kitchen hearths like sleepy generals, stirring endlessly, tossing in a pinch of this, a sniff of that. They knew, deep in their bones, how long to leave the rye bread near the coals, when the onions were soft enough, and at what point boiling water turned from just hot to don't touch that unless you want to speak to a priest. There were tools, of course. A pot hook, often called a trammel, hung from a sturdy beam, letting you adjust the pot's height like a medieval elevator, though your only destination was soup. Then there was the spit, used for roasting meat, if you were one of the fortunate few who owned a chicken and didn't have to sing it lullabies to stop the village from borrowing it overnight. Bread, that ancient carbohydrate comfort, was often baked in communal ovens. Instead of every home struggling with their own overly ambitious baking projects, as seen in quarantine times, and we all remember how that went, villagers would take turns at the shared oven, usually on specific days of the week. If you forgot your time slot, You might be waiting days, or bartering with your neighbour Janet, who was always smug about her sourdough. And yes, everyone knew Janet's dark rye wasn't from scratch. Not that we're bitter. While we drift here, with soft medieval smoke curling toward the straw and thatch ceiling, it's important to recall that cleanliness standards were, well, let's say, interpretive. Dishes weren't always washed so much as wiped and wept over. Grease-soaked pans could be scoured with sand or ash. And don't look too closely at that wooden spoon. It's stirring your dinner and your memory of last week's onions. Still, meals weren't purely functional. They were also social. Times when the family gathered by murky candlelight, bowls in hand, dogs snoring beneath the benches. Perhaps someone told a joke, or a simple prayer was muttered. Perhaps old Nan offered a particularly grumbly opinion on the merits of overcooked turnips. There was rhythm in these meals, even music, the clink of the ladle, the spatter of bubbling grains, the muffled laughter of someone realizing they'd eaten an entire onion. Again. So close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself there, kneeling near the fire, breath misting, the scent of earthy soup in the air. Your shoulders ache slightly from the day's labours, but the hearth is warm and the bowl in your hand is heavier than expected, rich with turnips, leeks, and the rare luxury of something that might possibly be meat. Don't question it. Just smile at Janet and chew softly. And when the hearth begins to dim and the firelight dances slower, we'll gently turn our gaze to a place where flavour found ambition. The bustling kitchens of a medieval manor, where cooks wore aprons and secrets. In the slow blue hush of medieval mornings, before the rooster could recall his tune, and while the thatch roofs still wore their silver frost caps, groggy villagers shuffled toward the heart of every household, the hearth. No matter how lopsided the house, or how creaky the floorboards, if it had a hearth, it had a beating heart. It wasn't just for cooking, you see. It was central heating, a smoke machine, an indoor tanning bed, somewhat, and occasionally the village gossip centre. Children were shooed away from it, only to sneak back seconds later with bread crusts or semi-legal turnips in hand. Old dogs curled up near it like sentient floor rugs. Nearby cats glared at the dogs with a level of disdain only a cat on a warm rock can muster. At the fire, the housewife, or occasionally house husband, depending on who won the arguments that week, would orchestrate breakfast with the care of a maestro and the resignation of someone who knows dinner will be soup again. Morning meals depended heavily on what the weather, the pantry, the livestock, and luck had provided. A common breakfast might involve bread soaked in milk or ale, stale bread, mind you, since fresh bread was more of a medieval luxury than new shoes during a drought. If you were particularly fancy or lived near a cow that was compliant or bribable, there might be a smear of cheese too, possibly flecked with suspicious green bits that everyone politely ignored. But perhaps the most beloved participant in the morning ritual was porridge. Glorious, noble, endlessly repeatable porridge. It began humbly, coarse grains stirred patiently over low heat, often with water, sometimes with milk, rarely with much else. Its strength was simplicity. It warmed bellies and tempered tempers. Folks disagreed on much in medieval Europe, but everyone agreed porridge was fine, especially when flavoured with a splash of treacle or the scandalous hint of honey. But let's not be hasty. The stirring of porridge itself was a matter of quiet tradition. It was said that witches stirred anti-clockwise, so naturally, good Christians stirred clockwise. No one really knew what would happen if you stirred both ways in one sitting, but prudence suggested avoiding such reckless culinary acrobatics when still half asleep. Suppose it was one of those better mornings. Maybe the chickens had graced the world with an egg, and the neighbor with the chestnut tree had forgotten to close his gate. The possibilities multiplied. A poached egg might simmer gently in a clay pot over the embers, watched like precious treasure. Chestnuts might be roasted and diced into something resembling a medieval granola topping. Delight or diabetes, depending on your perspective. The smell of peat smoke and bubbling pottage mingled with the heavy fog outside, seeping into tunics, braids, and breakfast dreams. Children with hay in their hair wandered in and out, draped in hand-me-downs that resisted being clean. They'd grab what food they could and vanish again like small, muddy ghosts. By mid-morning, the house would shift. Chores would call, animals would bay for attention, and the hearth would settle into a gentle simmer. The pot, though, often stayed on much of the day, contents evolving with every scraping spoonful added or removed. A perpetual stew, they called it, the culinary embodiment of, just throw it in. In wealthier homes, or at least wealth-adjacent ones, breakfast could include more refined fare, a bit of smoked fish, or cold meat from last night's roast. But even these were humble beside the glorious ambition of the middling classes. The hopeful artisan or well-fed merchant's wife who dared to attempt spiced oatcakes. Spices, after all, were expensive little mysteries that could elevate any dish, or ruin it spectacularly. Nutmeg was shed like confetti over hot gruel. Cinnamon whispered into dry crusts reawakened them with the memory of warmth somewhere, possibly imagined. The more spices you had, the more people assumed you either had wealth, good taste, or a cousin who sailed indecently close to piracy. And there it all was, each morning, the crackle of kindling, the rhythm of the wooden spoon, the wheezing of the bellows, coaxing breakfast into being. It wasn't dazzling, but it nourished minds and bodies alike. A quiet ritual, a predictable comfort in a chaotic world, the start of a long day in a short life. Soon, the table would be cleared. The pigs would need chasing, the fields tilling, but the ember glow of the hearth lingered like a vague, warm memory. Now, if you're wondering what might happen after breakfast, when the bread's been broken and the spoons put down, well, there's always the matter of what they drank with those meals. And spoiler alert, it was usually suspiciously unwater-like. But that, as the smoke curls and the day stretches open, is a sip best saved for another moment. As the moon hung low like a sleepy pewter coin in the medieval sky, flickering hearthlight glowed from timbered windows up and down the narrow, mud-caked lanes of the village. And inside those humble cottages, a quiet kind of alchemy took place, not with bubbling potions or broomstick cackling. No, this magic was softer. It was the humble evening meal. Let us drift for a moment into the heart of one such home, a thatched roof cottage nestled between the worn path of weary oxen and the distant chant of vespers from the abbey down the hill. Here lives a woman named Marjorie. Not a noble, not a wizard, just a woman with strong calves, calloused hands, and a surprisingly deadly aim with a wooden spoon. Tonight, Marjorie is making pottage. Again, and again, and again, the same way she did yesterday, and likely how she'll do it tomorrow. Pottage, for the uninitiated, also known as please make this turnip taste like anything else, was the backbone of medieval peasant cuisine, a sort of eternal stew. It simmered endlessly in a clay pot over the fire, with new ingredients added as they became available, or simply found. Some mornings that meant last week's cabbage, other days the generous gift of a neighbour's onion surplus. Once a year, usually after something conveniently tripped and died in the forest, there might even be a scrap of meat. But mostly, it was root vegetables, grains like barley or oats, leafy greens, and the occasional sprinkle of dried herbs if you'd made peace with the village priest that week. There were no fridges, of course, nor pantries stacked with imported spices from imaginary lands called Trader Joe's. So, food preservation was its own kind of wizardry. Marjorie, like most clever folk of her age, knew the arts of salting, smoking, and drying with the kind of precision we now reserve for mastering espresso machines. Salted fish, for example, might sound like a punishment today, but back then it was sustenance and salvation. Whole herring were packed in barrels with layers of salt until they resembled stiff, scaly scrolls. And while they may not have inspired poetry, they certainly inspired chewing. Lots and lots of chewing. Speaking of poetry, meals were often painfully quiet affairs, not out of reverence, mind you, but because when you're gnawing on 7-day-old rye bread that could chip a tooth, you tend to keep your mouth occupied with survival. Bread, in its various threatening forms, was the second great staple, sometimes made with wheat, if you were lucky. More often oat, rye, or even peas and chestnuts, ground into a grim approximation of flour. The inferior kind was called horse bread, a delicacy for horses and a chewable compromise for people. We mustn't forget dairy. Cows, goats, and even sheep were squeezed for their creamy offerings. Milk was rarely drunk straight. It spoiled faster than a jousting match in the rain. Instead, it became tangy cheeses or thickened into something curiously resembling yogurt after being left in a warm place long enough to develop its own folklore. But oh, the eggs, precious oval miracles laid by chickens who clearly had a flair for drama, laying fewer in winter and hiding them under hedges when they fancied a game of Can You Find Breakfast. A lucky household might enjoy a soft-boiled egg in spring, or even work one into a custard if a passing nun spilled her cinnamon stash. In richer seasons, the village would come alive with flavour. Wild garlic along hedgerows, elderflowers turning into syrupy cordials, dandelions appearing in salads before villagers discovered that rabbits had gotten there first. There was something beautifully cyclical to it all. Menus written not by desire, but by the passage of time and trust in the fields. And so, Marjorie stirred her pottage as stars blinked awake above the thatch. Little Thomas snored softly on his pile of straw by the hearth, and her husband, Jankin, mumbled a dream about chickens plotting a rebellion. Another day softened into night, not with theatrics, but with the gentle rhythm of survival. And maybe, just maybe, a slightly fresher turnip. Tomorrow, perhaps, a neighbour would bring word of a pig roast 3 fields over. Or a wandering friar might trade a pinch of saffron for a song and some scandal. But that's a story best left for when the fire burns lower and the dreams run wilder. The summer fair of 1372 in the sleepy English hamlet of Lower Thistlewick was famed not for jousts or jesters, but for the most esteemed culinary competition in 3 parishes. The Great Peasant Pottage Off. Picture it. A dozen hunched peasants, proudly guarding their cauldrons like nervy alchemists, stirring with intent, offering steaming ladles of indistinguishable slop to a panel of judges who look slightly alarmed and very damp. Let's take a dreamy spoon and dip into the medieval peasant kitchen. Not the grand kitchens of lords with their spit-turners and pastry coffers, but the modest cook fires of ordinary folk, where pride went into even the humblest bowl of onions and oats. The backbone of most meals, pottage, a vague, ever-changing, stubbornly loyal stew. Pottage was less a recipe and more of a lifestyle. It was the Middle Ages' answer to forever soup, a pot that rarely stopped simmering, as if medieval peasants had accidentally invented slow cookers several centuries ahead of schedule. Every day the pot was warmed anew, and whatever the household had on hand went in. A turnip or three, a sprig of thyme if you were fancy, perhaps a rabbit if the gods and snares were kind. Leftover bits from yesterday became the sensible undertone of today's meal. It was rustic recycling long before it was smug. Now, unlike romanticized taverns in your favorite medieval video game, the average medieval home in the countryside had no gleaming kitchen. It had, more likely, smoke. Cooking happened over the hearth, with pots slung from iron tripods or hung from clever little hooks called trammels, renamed by children and cats as that thing I keep bumping into. Smoke filled the room freely. Chimneys, though known, were still in their flirtation phase with rural Europe, sometimes there, sometimes not. A smoke hole in the roof would do, assuming it wasn't raining sideways. In the mild panic of daily survival, having breathable air indoors took polite second place to keeping the soup warm. Bread, indispensable, versatile, occasionally used as a plate, was often made at communal bakehouses. Personal ovens were rare. Imagine baking bread over firewood you just spent 4 hours collecting, only to find your thatched roof joining in enthusiastically. Far safer to pop your dough over to Maud down the lane, who ran the local oven like a benevolent carb queen. For a small fee, or a share of your loaf, she'd bake yours with everyone else's, ensuring the whole village smelled like crusty joy twice a week. As for the basics, peasants lean hard on grains and pulses. Barley, rye, and oats form the canvas for most meals. Peas and beans, add them liberally. Cabbage, always. Cabbage showed up to every feast uninvited, but no one had the heart to turn it away. Besides, it stretched the pottage, and on lean days, chewing cabbage was the event of the afternoon. Meat was less a daily staple and more of a surprise twist. If you weren't served to a lord with table leftovers, you relied on trapping small game or occasionally stretching your definition of edible. Hedgehogs, snails, and songbirds made appearances, though they were sometimes morally or legally questionable. Poaching was illegal, unless it was very dark and no one told the reeve. But then, some households had a secret weapon, the herb garden. A few snipped sprigs of sage, marjoram, or lovage could elevate humble broth to near comfort-level delight, or at least trick your tongue into thinking it had attended a fancier dinner. These gardens, tended mostly by women, contained not just flavor enhancers, but medicinal allies. Chamomile for nerves, mint for digestion, and parsley for, well, looking smug. Despite the pulverizing monotony of peasant fare, porridge for breakfast, pottage for dinner, questionable bread at every turn, meal times were heartbeats of the day. Huddled around the fire, eyes stinging from smoke, you'd pass the wooden bowl and share stories, slurp amicably, and, if fortune smiled, end the meal with a sweet course of berries, apples, or a rare honeyed treat. And in the fare of Lower Thistlewick, the pottage off brought even more unforgettable culinary variety. One local innovator, Edric the Leek Harvester, wowed the judges by adding a poached egg into his barley stew, delivering what was flamboyantly declared rather decent. A scandal unfolded when a suspiciously rich and meaty pottage raised eyebrows. A local cat had gone missing that week, and rumours, quite unfairly, simmered. but let us leave the brave cooks of Lower Thistlewick to stir their concoctions under smoky banners and sheltering skies. For not far from the bubbling pots and plaid aprons, a different class of cook was wielding ladles and ladling dreams into trenchers of trencher bread. Bread, that humble, crusty cornerstone of medieval life, was rarely just a food. It was a tool, a tray, a unit of rent, a political metaphor, and occasionally someone's pillow if you were poor enough and the loaf was stale enough. But in every sleepy little hamlet and soot-darkened kitchen, bread was king. And like all monarchs, what it was made of and who got to eat it told you everything about the kingdom. For starters, not all bread was created equal. If you were richly blessed, or just flat out rich, you ate what's known as manchet bread. Soft, white and refined, manchet was the sourdough sibling who made it out of the village and got a law degree. Made from bolted wheat flour, a process that essentially separated the fine white interior of the grain from all those unruly bits like bran and knowledge of the working class. It was the kind of bread that practically shouted, "I've never held a shovel." The peasantry, on the other hand, usually dined on something more regional. Think of maslin bread, a hearty, sometimes rock-like blend of wheat and rye, or even horse bread, which, despite the name, was not just fed to horses, but also the people who couldn't afford to be picky or dental. Horse bread often contained legumes, bran, and other leftover bits of the agricultural lottery. It was the bread version of rummaging through your neighbour's compost pile and deciding, yes, this will do. Now, making bread was no simple three-step recipe involving Instagrammable sourdough starters and Scandinavian kitchen tiles. No, medieval bread making was a day-long drama, starting with the all-important grinding of grains. You could, if your village had one, take your grain to the local mill, where the miller, famously ranked somewhere between tax collectors and untrained dentists in public opinion, would keep a portion of the flour as his fee. This was called the mulcher, and coincidentally also the name of his new horse, purchased with your missing wheat. If for some reason you found milling too expensive, politically corrupt, or just wildly inconvenient, you could mill it at home using a quern, a hand-turned stone grinder that promised both a coarse flour and an impressive shoulder injury. It was backbreaking, time-consuming work, not to mention illegal in many places once lords realized they weren't getting a cut. Some households supposedly ground their grain in secret, whispering over the wine of stones, like would-be revolutionaries whose rallying cry was, "I just want pancakes." Once ground, the flour would be mixed with water, perhaps a bit of salt if you were feeling flush, and, if you happen to live in a yeast-forward region, some fermentation magic via balm from ale making, or a leftover bit of dough from the last baking. Kneading, naturally, was done with strong hands and sore wrists, often passed down from grandmother to mother to child in a generational relay of flour-caked affection. The oven situation, however, was where things got even toastier. Not every home had its own oven, and so many people relied on communal bakehouses. These were like neighborhood Wi-Fi, only instead of data, they distributed edible heat. You'd show up with your own shaped dough and perhaps your own baking tin, a reused clay vessel, or if you were quite poor, perhaps even a cabbage leaf or repurposed wooden plank. The baker, usually half asleep and entirely covered in a sweater of flour, would bake everyone's loaves in sequence, marking them with household symbols, cuts, burns, or small bits of carefully placed twine that might accidentally burst into flame. It was the sourdough version of a coat check. Communal ovens weren't just fire pits for food. They were social spaces, rumour exchanges, matchmaking hubs, and debate forums for things like, did Agnes use too much rye again? Or, is the priest truly fasting when he's sneaking in that second loaf? Of course, bread had its darker days, the most infamous being times of famine. When harvests failed and cupboards emptied, people resorted to baking with substitutes of dubious digestibility, acorns, bark flour, or even ground straw. These loaves were often more symbolic than sustaining, more like bread than actually bread, a sort of edible performance art. Still, through thick and thin, bread remained the heartbeat of every kitchen and the pause between every sentence in a long, slow medieval evening. Warm, coarse, often a little burnt, but beloved nonetheless. A humble slice of survival. And as village ovens cooled and the scent of yeast faded into the night air, our story rises on another cooking curiosity. One both piping hot and quietly simmering in sticky pots and seasoned iron. As twilight settled over the gables and thatched roofs of a sleepy medieval village, the stone hearths still glowed with the fading orange embers of the evening meal. The air, tinged with wood smoke and the faint spicy memory of something boiled far too long, hung gently across the winding lanes and tiny windows. Chickens cooed themselves to sleep in wooden coops, dogs curled snout in paw by the fire, and somewhere a very tired pot creaked as it was hoisted off a hook and wiped, somewhat optimistically, with a frayed bit of cloth that had once been white. We now arrive at one of the Middle Ages' least celebrated, but most crucial kitchen chores, cleaning up. For while brave knights rode into battle, and monks inked manuscripts in stunning calligraphy, someone, perhaps wearing an apron and muttering colourful phrases under their breath, was stuck scraping a hardened layer of turnip mush off a wooden bowl. You see, dishwashing in the Middle Ages was less a task and more a test of endurance. There was no soap. That fragrant, bubbly luxury wouldn't become common in most peasant homes for several centuries. Instead, people relied on sand, ash, and the hope that rinsing something in several handfuls of cloudy water would suffice. In finer households, think manor kitchens, abbeys, or anywhere employing someone called the scullion, the process involved vats of heated water, cloths for scrubbing, and long tables where wooden trenchers dried in rows like medieval dinnerware soldiers awaiting inspection. Trenchers, those humble, edible or reusable plates, were especially important. Made from stale bread in poorer places or scooped out wooden slabs in homes with marginally fewer rats, they did double duty: meal container and, when necessary, emergency dog bowl. After meals, the bread trenchers, soaked through with stew and drool, were sometimes fed to the poor or swine, briefly turning leftover mutton fat into a charitable deed. The trick with wooden or clay bowls, however, was to clean them without fully soaking them. Soaking could lead to cracks, mildew, or unexpected ecosystems growing in crevices. To avoid such things, people scrubbed briskly with sand or crushed eggshells, using the gritty texture to dislodge food bits. Sometimes they used herbs like thyme or rosemary in the rinse water, a sort of medieval dish soap meets aromatherapy. Of course, this was less about disinfecting and more about masking the smell of last week's leaks. In noble households, kitchen maids and boys fetched water in sloshing wooden buckets from rivers or wells. Carrying water was so tedious that it had its own job title: the water bearer. The nearest well could be down the hill, through 3 muddy lanes, and guarded fiercely by defective geese. By the time the water reached the scullery, It was a few degrees colder, several cups shorter, and partly seasoned with goose feathers. The real star of medieval cleanup, though, was fire. Or, more accurately, ash. Ash from the hearth was collected carefully and stored for all manner of practical purposes. As an abrasive, it was splendid at buffing out stubborn porridge residue or oil smacks from a pan. A little ash mixed with water made a dark grey sludge, perfect for scouring, though not exactly enchanting to the nose. For metal pans, the protocol was even harsher. The cook might scrub with sand and salt, then rinse the pot in boiling water and leave it to dry by the hearth, a process that gave pans a strange, dull sheen and a faint aroma of regret. Seasoned cooks could tell which pot was whose just by the scorch marks, like reading tea leaves, but angrier. And let us not forget the fate of leftover food. There were no refrigerators, no cling film, and no stern lectures about food safety. Some scraps went to servants or livestock. Others were reboiled into a new meal, transforming Tuesday's rabbit stew into Wednesday's slightly less identifiable rabbit thing. Anything truly inedible, bones, gristle, the occasional hoof, was tossed onto the midden heap, a kind of open-air compost pile that doubled as the village's aromatic mascot. Despite the grime and the elbow grease, there was an order to it all, a rhythm, a last ritual before the house tucked in for the night. Once the pots were scrubbed, the ashes swept, and the table wiped down with a cloth that felt more hope than cotton, the rushlights were trimmed and the doors barred. Outside, the moon cast a sleepy glow across gardens and haystacks. Inside, kitchens hushed, curls of smoke sighed from chimneys, and the quiet promise of another meal tomorrow simmered vaguely in every dry bowl and empty pot. And just as the fire settled into embers and the last crumbs met their destinies, something rattled gently in the pantry. A mouse, perhaps, or maybe just a forgotten sack of barley, dreaming of breakfast. As the medieval daylight gave way to candlelit dusk and the scent of wood smoke thickened under thatch and tile, our attention turns now to that most noble of disasters, the medieval dinner party. Or rather, its more modest cousin, the village feast. Less of a soiree, more of a potluck, where everyone brings something, even if it's just their opinion. Now, when we think of entertainment paired with food, we often picture string quartets, wine, pairings, and great aunts with harrowing opinions about rutabagas. But in medieval times, food was the entertainment, and the cook was not simply a measurer of grains and guardian of fire. Oh no. The cook was drama, diplomacy, and the occasional misplaced ladle all rolled into one. Feasts, as informal as they may seem in the village green or the corner of a cramped hall, were often orchestrated moments of collective survival pride. Harvests luckily gathered, winters endured, weddings approved by all 3 goats and a priest. In such situations, everyone had a role. Someone would bring barley bread that looked suspiciously like a defensive weapon. Someone else proudly unveiled a stew thick enough to be used as mortar. And there was almost always that one person who brought pickled something and would not reveal what. The village cook, sometimes just the person with the biggest pot and the lowest ceiling, had the unenviable task of preparing something edible yet symbolic. A dish that said, we are full of community spirit, and also, we really need salt. So what might such a feast involve? Vegetables, for starters. Lots and lots of vegetables. Not because of any early trend in clean eating, but because they grew them, frequently and in spades. Cabbages, onions, leeks, turnips, and legumes formed the bedrock of nearly every dish. assuming they survived the goats. A thick pottage, imagine a porridge made of enthusiasm, garden remnants and hope, was common fare. It would gloop attractively into a wooden bowl, steaming mild comfort. Each household might have done it differently, based on what was available or what wasn't already suspiciously nibbled. Grains were also ubiquitous, not just bread, which walked the fine line between nourishment and knuckle duster, but also porridges and ale-softened flatbreads. Wheat was a luxury in some areas. More often, people used rye, barley, or spelt. The resulting loaves could be robust, long-lasting, and capable of doubling as building materials in a pinch. If the stars aligned, meaning if someone's cousin's cousin had just slaughtered a pig, you might see meat. Pork, salted and a little assertive, was often saved for such gatherings. More commonly, though, meat came in tiny, symbolic fragments, tucked into communal stews. Think of it as a medieval meaty cameo. Fish played a starring role, especially in regions near rivers, lakes, or blessed by particularly moist ditches. Herring was common, and if it wasn't pickled, it was dried, smoked, or part of a mysterious spiritual process involving barrels and patience. For those with a sweet tooth, and yes, even amid hardship, sugar cravings emerged like dandelions. There were delicacies. Honey cakes, if someone had bees and bravery. Berries folded into rough dough. Or, most festively, a dried fruit mash squeezed tightly into questionable shapes and declared a dessert with great fanfare. As the modest feast unspooled over the evening, stories fed the soul just as much as broth warmed the bellies. Elders would recount the time the windmill nearly collapsed, only to be rescued by a particularly stubborn sheep. Children would dash between legs, looking for dropped crusts and forgotten pears. Music might rise, not harps and lutes, but pipes carved from reeds, viol-like fiddles strung with horsehair, and the occasional spoons clacked with zeal. Of course, medieval revelry was lit not just by candles, but by gossip. Who had recently evaded the manor's taxes by pretending to be a travelling friar? Who had been seen suspiciously close to the blacksmith's daughter with a suspiciously polished carrot? The feast stirred these narratives like ladles stirring stew, occasionally burning the bottom. As the firelight flickered lower and mugs were drained in good-natured exhaustion, one could almost forget the grind of toil and rule. As a communal act, eating together was less about the calories and more about the comfort. The bonding over burned crusts, the shared silence when the stew was actually passable, and the collective gasp when someone revealed they'd spiced their dish. With imported pepper no less, scandalous and thrilling. And so, in the hush before bed, as embers gave way to dreams and crumbs lingered in beards and folds, the final pots were scraped and silence gently began to settle. But the tale, much like the pottage, simmers just a little longer, still warm on the tongue. And at last, we close our worn and crumb-flaked medieval cookbook beside the hearth. As the fire dwindles to soft, amber coals, let us wander one last time through the hush of a forgotten kitchen, where ordinary folks in tunics and apron smocks pass the spoon from hand to hand, with more heart than hygiene and more spirit than spices. By now, you've learned that medieval cooking was rarely glamorous, but it was wonderfully alive. It was peasant women in smoky cottages smacking barley loaves into shape with calloused hands. It was blackened pots hung on iron tripods, hovering over fires that didn't know the meaning of medium heat. It was onions, so many onions, boiled until they surrendered, mingling with beans, leeks, or the occasional indecisive turnip, But there's something quietly dazzling in that simplicity. Imagine for a moment it's twilight in a village somewhere in 13th century England. Children chase each other in the dusty lane, chasing laughter and geese in equal measure. Inside one cottage, there's a pot of pottage bubbling eagerly, a humble stew that's had last night's barley, the week's vegetables, a hopeful mushroom or two, and one suspicious dried fish, all tossed together like an edible confessional. Over time, this pottage becomes a bit of a family diary. Day after day, a little more is added, a little more ladled out. It tastes of roots and toil and very faint hope. In the Middle Ages, this was as close to a slow cooker as one could get, except the pot never stopped, and the recipes were passed down not on parchment, but by pure repetition and whispered tweaks. Seasoning? Well, yes, but not much. Salt was precious. Spices were imported fantasy. But herbs, glorious weeds were everywhere. Nettles, parsley, marjoram if you were fancy. They were plucked from roadside or garden's edge, scrubbed with suspicion, and tossed into the pot with a blessing to same flavour. Yes, if you were wealthy, your table might dance with clove and cinnamon, with dishes crusted in layers of honey and spice like medieval Instagram meals. But for the vast crumbling majority, food was not cuisine. It was survival with a dash of rhythm. Everything tied to the calendar of seasons. You'd eat gooseberries when the gooseberries came. You'd gnaw dried apples when winter insisted. Bread was never just bread. It was your spoon, your plate, your insurance policy against actual starvation. Sometimes it was made of wheat, if you lived near a good lord, or out of rye, barley, and sheer determination if you didn't. In lean months, peasants added sawdust, mashed tree bark, or ground beans to stretch their dough. It wasn't ideal, digestion-wise, but it kept hearts beating and mouths chewing. In monasteries, things were different, more orderly. There, monks fashioned cheese rounds like contemplative prayer wheels. They brewed hearty ales with a reverence rivaling scripture. Abstaining from meat on certain holy days didn't mean going hungry. It meant richly buttery fish pies or delicate herb soups made with so much toil. They'd tire a modern chef well before Vespers. And lest you think women were absent from the culinary cathedral of the Middle Ages. Oh, quite the contrary. Women were the architects of daily meals, the preservers of generations-old methods, salting fish, drying apples, making vinegar, brewing ale before it got regulated into masculine territory. Each act of cooking was a mastery of temperature, texture, and timing, often without recipes. The spoon was guided by instinct, memory, and whether or not the baby was crying. By the late Middle Ages, some towns began opening public bakehouses, so folks without their own oven could bring dough and walk away with something crusted and golden. An early version of take-and-bake pizza, if you squint hard enough and forgive the lack of mozzarella. And through all of this, through the heaving feasts of lords, and the whispered hum of sickroom broths in cracked bowls, cooking was a tether. It connected people to their patch of land, their saints, their seasons, and each other. So now, the night stretches long and quiet. The fields are asleep, the fires are cinders, and the cooks, whether wimpled or barefoot, have hung their ladles for the night. We step gently out of the past and close the pantry door behind us, the scent of centuries still clinging to the air, a mix of wood smoke, lentils, hope, and the unmistakable aroma of cabbage that's tried its best. You, dear listener, have journeyed far through kitchens long gone. Now rest your eyes and settle your mind like flour settling in a sack, soft, still, and quietly historic. Sleep well, and may your dreams be seasoned just right